This is part 2 of the Craftsman King Seeley 100 drill press conversion and rebuild series. If you haven't seen part 1, click the link at the top of the screen. In this video, we're going to continue the disassembly. Hello everyone, I'm Jeff and welcome to my shop. We got a lot to cover, so let's get to it. Continuing with disassembling the head, we're going to remove the headband panel. That's the engine turn panel. And this is held in place by 2 drive screws, and you can tap these out from the inside just using a small punch. And then the other side, and then we'll set that aside. And then next we have the Craftsman logo panel, and it's held in the same way, although these holes are a little bit harder to access. And it has 2 drive screws holding it in. And once we get it out of there, get it lined up and tap it, there it is. So then we've got one more. And boom. We'll set that aside. So that's everything on the head disassembled at this point. So next we're going to disassemble or start to disassemble the spindle pulley assembly. So this has an inner snap ring that I'm just using a pair of snap ring pliers to expand and then lift off of there. There we go. Set that aside. And next, sometimes you can pull those bearings off of there by hand. Not the case on this drill press, so we're going to spray the seam between the bearing and the shaft for both of the bearings down with some PB Blaster and let that sit for the time being. Next, we have the hub and pinion, and I'm just going to tap the hub off of the pinion with this punch and a hammer. I'll work my way around it. Most of the time you can just pull this right off of the pinion, but again, not on this drill press. Once we've got it below that hole, we should be able to pull it off the rest of the way. There we go. So that completes disassembly of the hub pinion spring assembly. And we are back over at the spindle pulley assembly. And here I'm just going to use a 2-jaw puller and a piece of bar steel and spin that pulley or that bearing right off of there. And we're going to replace all of these bearings. And there's the sleeve that separates the two bearings. And this bearing, in order to get that puller under this bearing, I have to lift this bearing up a little bit. And the best method I've come up with to do this is just to use 2 wrenches and kind of force it up while pushing out on the wrenches. And I'm being careful here not to bend the pulley in any way. And it's already rising up some, and there we go. So that's all the space we really need to get that puller under there. And then we're going to just extract it the same way we extracted the other bearing. However, this one's on there a little bit tighter, so we're going to take the whole pulley and puller over to a vise and do it over at the vise. And once it gets past where the first bearing was, it should come off there no problem. There we go. And that is the complete disassembly of the spindle pulley assembly. Next we have the column, and again you can do this exact same method, although you'd have to lay it down on the floor to remove a column from a floor standing base. But we're just tapping the column out of the base itself, and then I'm using a piece of bar steel. And you want to be careful not to grab the edge of the cast iron because you'll chip it or break it. We're just putting it directly on top of the column. And there we go. And we should be able to pull it out by hand the rest of the way. So letting that PB blaster really sit on there for an hour or two or overnight really helps in extracting that column. So here we're just removing the model number plate, and it's the same whether you're doing it on a bench top or a floor base. And that is the column lock shoe. That would be in the floor base or the bench top as well. And there's your model number panel. So next we're going to disassemble the motor, and I already disassembled a good bit of it, and then I put it back so that I could record it because, again, I did not hit record. So I was just showing that I removed the 4 mounting bolts and then removed the mount itself. And then that is the capacitor cover that has 2 screws. And then inside, and these aren't always there, but you should have a cardboard sleeve that the capacitor sits in. There's your capacitor. And I just cut the leads coming off of the capacitor, and then I marked them. And we've got the power cord. So this was not grounded, although we will ground it. So I just cut the leads off the power cord and marked them. And then we have the switch, which not all of these will have switches, but most of them do. We just cut those 2 leads and marked them. So next, we're caught up with what I failed to record initially. And we're going to just remove the 2 bolts that hold the base on the stator. There's one of them. There's the second one. This is where we're going to ground the motor when we do ground it with one of these bolts. And then there's the base. And it has a rubber grommet that the power cord rides through. And we're just going to remove that, and we'll be replacing it. And that's the base. So there are two sides to this base, one that's an angled and one that's kind of a step. The step side is where the switch goes. So if yours doesn't have a switch, that way you can tell which side the switch is supposed to go on. So next we're removing the felt cover. It has 4 screws. And then you can lift it up. And the felt stuck to it. So we'll just remove the felt. And next we have the end cap and the end cap gasket, and that is the spring washer. So you'll notice we're working on the opposite side of the motor from the terminal end because there's no terminal cover here. So this is the side that gets the spring washer when you reassemble it. Sometimes those gaskets are just too far gone, and I'll make another one. Just cut it out by hand with some gasket material. So you have the felt cover, the felt, the gasket cover, and the gasket and the spring washer. Now we're on the terminal inside, and I'm going to go ahead and shoot some PB Blaster in there to start loosening up that pulley. So that pulley has 2 set screws in it. Some of them only have 1. But I've already removed the set screws, but the pulley's still not coming off of there. And this motor's completely seized right now. The bearings are seized in it. So I'm actually turning just the pulley. I'm turning it around the shaft itself. So here I've just clamped the motor down so that I can turn that pulley off of the shaft. It's almost like it's threaded, which it's not. It just slides on there, but that shaft, this end of the shaft is so marred up that the pulley's not going to come off of there unless I do it this way. So there's your motor pulley. All right, so here we are on the terminal end, and we're removing the felt cover for this side. Again, it has 4 screws. A lot of times these screws are damaged because somebody let the pulley ride too low and it sat there and just chewed away the top of those screws. So we can just lift the felt cover, and then we have the felt. This is exactly the same as the other side, except there's no spring washer on the terminal side. There's your felt. And your gasket cover. Just making sure the gasket didn't stick to it like the other side. So the gasket is stuck on the motor end frame, so we can just work that scraper around it and get it off of there. And then we've got the terminal cover that we're going to remove. A lot of times these are missing and I end up having to fabricate one. But it has 2 screws that hold it on. We'll set it aside. Also, a lot of times on the inside of that terminal cover, there will be instructions on how to reverse the direction of the motor. So here we're just removing, there are 2 wires on the top of the terminal bar. And I'm just cleaning up the terminal bar itself so I can see the numbers that they're on the terminal bar so that I mark them properly. And just so you know, all you have to do is reverse those two wires, which reverses the direction of the motor. So that diagram is not critical. And I'll put the owner's manual for this motor in the description of the video as well. So you'll have access to the owner's manual for the drill press and for the motor. So undoing the second wire and marking it. And some of you will be happy to know that I bit the bullet and bought a second camera. And I built a rig so I can get footage from shooting straight down on top. But I didn't have it by the time that I did all this. So I do have it now. So that should make future videos better so you can see more of what's going on. So here we're just removing the 4 long screws. These have acorn nuts on each end of the screw. Once we've got all 4 of those out, we can go ahead and remove the stator band. And to do that, we're just going to use a screwdriver and pry it up. And then you can slide the 2 halves apart. Not that you can see that, but there you go. Then we can slide the stator band off of the motor itself. And then we can go ahead and remove the other end frame. So we have the terminal end and then we have the other end. Literally, that's how it's listed in the owner's manual and parts diagram. So to do this, we're going to need a puller again. And we're just going to pull it straight up. So the bearing may stay with it, or the bearing may stay on the shaft. It's really, nobody knows what's going to happen until you start doing it. In this situation, the bearing stayed with the end frame. No big deal. So now that we have that end frame off of there, inside it there is an air cone, and so we're going to remove the air cone. It has 2 screws that hold it in place. And if these suckers are in there real tight, you might have to get a smaller, shorter screwdriver to get more leverage on it, but like I am here, to keep from stripping out those screws. And sometimes they are kind of stripped, so smack that sucker and then turn it and you're good to go. Then the air cone comes right out. And now we're going to remove that bearing. So we're just going to use a wooden dowel and knock that bearing straight out. On this end frame, it doesn't matter which direction you're pushing the bearing out, but on the terminal end, it does matter. And I'll show you why in a little bit. So like I said, the bearings are seized, so the rotor is not turning at all. So what we're going to do is we're going to put the other end frame back on there so that we're not balancing the motor on the windings. And then we're going to drive the rotor through the bearing that's on the terminal end. With a rubber mallet, a dead blow hammer. And when it breaks, it will go. There we go. So now we can get the rotor out. So we can pull the other end frame off of there. And then try to pull that rotor out. If it still doesn't want to come, tap the other end of it with that mallet again. And it will come. There we go. We'll set that aside. So now we have the terminal end frame we need to knock loose from the stator. And then since these motors were built in the 40s and the 50s, and some of them in the 60s, the wires inside them are very brittle. And we do not want to break any of those lead wires coming off of the stator. So very carefully, I open up this end, and then I don't want to bend those wires too much. So I'm going to rest the end frame on a 2x4, and then we can start disassembling the inside. So here we have the Klaxon thermal protection switch. Sometimes these go bad. You can get replacements. But I've only had one motor where that switch was bad. Most of the time they're still completely serviceable. There's two screws that hold it in place, and we can remove those and then pull that out of there. Now it's got one lead that went to a capacitor, I believe, and the other lead is going to the terminal bar, I believe. I'm removing the terminal bar screws right now. And again, having that camera that looks straight down on this would really be helpful. And I'm just magnetizing a screwdriver so that I can get those screws out of there once I get them loose. There's two screws on the terminal bar, and then there's two screws on the switch. Now I'm just going to go ahead and undo all of that right now. And then we'll be able to move the end frame out of the way and work with just the wires. So as we're looking at it, on top is the switch. Under the switch is the switch insulation, which is cardboard. So there's your switch. Make sure it still works. Then there's the insulation, and then there's the switch cover. So you've got your terminal bar and your Klaxon still in there. Klaxon, Clixon, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. So the end of the Clixon that's going to the terminal bar, once we undo the screws that hold the rest of the wires to the terminal bar, that will come off of there. So as we undo these screws and take a look at the wires and what port they are plugged into, and then mark them accordingly. So I'm looking for the number, and then those wires were all on the bottom side of the terminal bar. Not that it really matters, you could put them on the top side as well, but they're not long enough really to make it all the way around to the top side and then have room to work in there. So where I put a 4B on that, that goes to the number 4 slot, and then B is for the bottom. I'm sure it's not the method that some electrician would use, but that's how I mark stuff. So this is the number 2 position, and that means that 2 wires are going to get marked 2B. One coming off the stator and one coming off of the klaxon. Clicks on, clacks on. All right, and there's your terminal bar. And there's the stator, and we'll set that aside. So the next thing we got to do is get this bearing out of this end frame. And we're going to drive the bearing from the inside out. And on this end, you have to remove the bearing in this direction. And the reason is because there's a lip on the inside of that bore that the bearing rides on. And it's a very small lip. It's very hard to see. But I'm going to try to show you here. See that lip? So if you tried to drive the bearing towards the inside, it would just be smacking that lip and you'd eventually break the cast iron. So here we are with the motor mount, and we're just going to drive the 2 motor mount pins out of the mount. That's not necessary to do this, but I do it so I can clean those pins up in my metal lathe. So next we're going to disassemble the governor switch or centrifugal switch that's on the rotor. And it has 2 springs on it. So you just unhook the springs from each end. Doing this with rubber gloves is not advised because I just got my gloves stuck in the spring, but no big deal. Same for the other side. And then I bend out the bracket that holds the 2 governors in place. These are the pieces that fly outward with the centrifugal force. So once you've got both of those off of there, you've got the, there's a plastic piece that's called a governor as well. And then there is the spring that connects to that plastic piece. And then there's a metal cup washer that the spring rests on. And then there's a paper insulator, that white ring. Now, it's not necessary to disassemble the governor if you're just going to clean everything up and replace bearings, but I do it because I'm going to soak this sucker in simple green and citric acid. And that is going to wrap up this video. So in the next video, we'll disassemble the chuck and anything else we have left, and then we'll work on cleaning all this stuff up. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like and subscribe. As always, I appreciate the support, and I will see you next time.